All right, now I'm going to kind of transition a little bit from the West Point model, and then I'm going to start talking about some of what I think are some of the key elements to successful leadership. These are the attributes, these are the skills I think that are absolutely necessary for success. All right, I want to talk now a little bit about those characteristics. And I pulled out here what I think are the three most important characteristics of leadership. Live a life of character, live a life of excellence, and find your passion and live it. So let me walk through each one of these. The first one, let's have a conversation about character. Next couple slides, we'll talk about that. I told you when I was in Iraq, I really understood how important character was for effective leadership. I was in Iraq maybe about a month and a half. I had northern Iraq where ISIS hung out. You saw that recently in the news. I had responsibility for the city of Mosul in Nineveh province. And on the western part of Mosul was one of the most hostile areas. And I had a tremendous battalion there, the 3rd Battalion, 8th Cavalry, commanded by a battalion commander who was beloved by his soldiers. He was a man of character. He was a man of great competence. And it was a tremendous story. And then unfortunately, on one day and one afternoon, a suicide vehicle drove right next to his vehicle. He exploded, of course, killing himself, but he killed the battalion commander and everybody else in that vehicle. And it was devastating to the battalion to lose their beloved commander. Of course, you know, at that point, as a division commander, I flew up there, met with the leadership, put somebody else in charge, and knew we had to get through this. So we found a replacement for him. He was with another command in Baghdad. That general officer allowed him to be released and assigned to me. We put him in as battalion command. A very good leader, very competent leader. And next thing you know, I find all of a sudden this person starts to have some issues. His boss calls me up and said, General Kaz, you're not going to believe this. I have to start an investigation on this new commander. He's having an online relationship with one of his staff officers back in the United States. And I'm going, give me a break, you know. So, and now the whole unit understands what's going on. And so there's this trust issue, and we had to relieve him of command. Had to be fired. So in the course of about 2 months, this unit went through a commander who was beloved, a man of character and competence, to a man of competence, of terrible character. The unit's morale was devastated. The competence of the unit to be able to perform their mission just dropped significantly. And I had to pull parts of that unit out of combat, put them into another training area, retrain them, retrain their leaders, and then get them back into there. This is what I said before. It's not just the person whose career is now ended. It's the competence of the entire organization that is now impacted because of a leader who is removed for character. And that's when I realized that character is a big issue in leadership. And if you fail in character, you fail in leadership. Why is this important? Because there's a great book. It's written by Stephen Covey. It's called The Speed of Trust. And in that book, Stephen Covey says, if you have an organization that has such great trust with everybody, that organization will move at lightning speed because people don't question, they don't go back and check. They just trust what you're doing and why you're doing it, and they're on board and they're moving forward. It's a great book, and I encourage you to get a chance to read it. Continuing with the conversation on character, a lot of people have trouble understanding what character is. I define character as an ethic that embraces your values. An ethic is nothing more than a set of principles, and those principles embrace the values that you're a part of. At West Point, the values of West Point included duty, honor, and country, and the values of the United States Army are defined as loyalty, duty, respect, selfless service, honor and integrity, and personal courage. So character is embracing those values so they become part of your very essence. And as I said, Character produces trust, and trust is the most important element for effective leadership. So I would just ask the students a couple questions here. What do you think about character? Have you had some conversations about character? How does character fit in your world? And then I would just say, take a look at your partners. Take a look at those who work for you as subordinates. Take a look at those whom you work for as a boss. Do you trust them? If you don't trust them, where is that issue? Is that issue because of competence, or is that issue because of a character issue, or whatever? Okay, I said that live a life of character, and then I said live a life of excellence. Let's talk about living a life of excellence. So what you see on this slide is a bell-shaped curve. Think of that bell-shaped curve of your performance. Your performance, if you consistently perform on average, you're going to be right in the middle of that bell-shaped curve. But if you're performing on average, another word I like to use, and I hope there's a good Chinese translation for it, is if you're average or mediocre. I don't know about you, but I don't like being mediocre. I don't like being average. I know when I'm average, I'm in my comfort zone. I'm not being challenged. I know my left and right limit, and I'm comfortable. And it's good to be comfortable, don't get me wrong. But if you want to live a life of excellence, you want to go, take a look at that curve, 2 standard deviations to the right. You want to go where there's not a lot of area under that curve. You want to go, said another way, in areas where it's uncomfortable, in areas that you're not familiar with. And why do you want to go there? Because you want to stretch, because you want to learn and you want to grow. How are you going to learn and grow? You're probably going to make a mistake. And when you make a mistake, it's not bad to make a mistake. A mistake is an opportunity to learn. The best leaders I've ever seen encourage subordinates to get into areas they're uncomfortable with, to get into areas that they're unfamiliar with. Coach Mike Krzyzewski, West Point graduate, the famous basketball coach for Duke, national champion a number of times, Olympic champion. You know, he says something I think that's great. He said, I don't strive to win, I strive for excellence. Because out of excellence, success naturally happens. And that's living a life of excellence. So I encourage you to live a life of excellence. And the third one here that I think is tremendously important is this issue of passion. What is passion? Passion is the why. It answers the question why you're doing something, why you're so enthusiastic about something. I remember when I graduated from West Point, I was going to go in the Army and I had a 5-year obligation. And I was so committed that I would just do my 5 years and get out. But what I found out was I was in infantry, airborne ranger. I was at the tip of the spear. And the brotherhood that we had with the men of that platoon, that infantry platoon, we became so close that we depended upon each other. We trusted each other. There was nothing that we could not do. We felt that we were invincible, and we were so close. And I ended up loving that brotherhood because of shared hardships and knowing that you as the leader were in charge and those men depended upon you for everything that you did. And I found my passion out of that. I found my passion of leading in leadership. I found my passion of leading under ugly, hard circumstances. And because I found my passion of leading under tough circumstances, my 5-year obligation became 10 years and then 15 years and 20, and I ended up staying in the Army not 5 years, but 43 years until the Army kicked me out because I hit my mandatory retirement date. Passion. Passion allowed me to stay in the Army, to want to be in the Army. Why do you need passion? Because when you find your passion, you're going to do whatever it takes to be successful. Said another way, you're not going to negotiate the price for success. Think about that. When you see a difficult task in front of you and you start negotiating with yourself, do I really want to do this? Am I really going to go all out? And then you kind of get this feeling of, no, I'm not. You know, that's negotiating the price for success. If you have a passion, you don't go there. You're going to say, I don't care what it takes. I don't care. I'm going to do whatever it takes to accomplish the mission. So students, the question I would ask you is, what is your passion? Have you found your passion? I hope you do. I hope you find your passion. All right, now I have this list of 10 leadership skills that I think are tremendously important. I have talked about the first three: character, excellence, and purpose. I do want to talk about the other 7, some in more detail than the other ones. I want to talk about number 4 that you see on this slide: teamwork. The way I like to look at teamwork is that's what leaders do. They build teams, they're part of teams, and it's the thing I like to say about teams is it's we, not I. And the best leaders are part of the best teams. So you got to look at teamwork from building the team, being a teammate with your teammates, and being a subordinate as a member of the team. Let me walk you through each one. The team leader, building a team. So building a team means that you are going to develop a group of men and women who are tough, who are tight, who are cohesive. They have high standards. They're disciplined, and they end up performing at the high level in everything they do. That's what you want. How do you get there? What do you do to develop that? Quite simply, you get your teammates to perform to levels that they're unfamiliar and uncomfortable with. It's that passion of excellence. It's getting them to perform to the upper level of their potential. It's getting them into areas that they're uncomfortable so they can stretch and they can grow. And when they grow as individuals, they bring the whole team with them. The whole team grows as well. What you have to do, leader, is you have to underwrite the risk. Unfortunately, a lot of people see when people stretch and make a mistake, they see that mistake as something that's wrong. It's not necessarily okay to make the mistake. If it's okay to make the mistake if you can learn and don't make the mistake again. And that's the key thing there, leader, is to be able to underwrite that risk. The other thing that's important is that you want to exercise initiative so that all the tasks that everybody has as part of their organization is that they can identify themselves in that task, that they understand their purpose. And when you understand the institution's purpose and you understand your personal purpose in it, and when those two are aligned, that organization is going to take off. The key thing in that is that everyone feels that they're value added. And what does that produce? This is an important point. They feel good about themselves in your organization. Notice I did not say they feel good about you. Then they feel good about themselves. And when they feel good about themselves, they feel good about the organization. You know, I had a great assignment. I was in the Joint Readiness Training Center in Fort Polk, Louisiana. I was an evaluator of units that would come through a very, very demanding training exercise. And as a chief evaluator, I saw great leaders and I saw not so great leaders. But what really made the difference of the great leaders is that as soon as I walked into that organization's headquarters, you could tell right away there was a buzz of activity. There were people all over the place moving around, talking with each other. There was formal conversation going on. There was informal conversation. There were low subordinates that were talking to senior level people, and the senior level people stopped to listen to them. There was a climate where everybody was value added. Everybody had a purpose. And everybody wanted to go into other areas. And in the evening, when it came time to brief the commander, the boss, I loved and watched it because the staff was falling over themselves. They all wanted to brief the boss because they wanted to brag about the work that they were doing. And then the senior staff allowed the junior staff to do a lot of the briefings as opportunities to grow and to really brag about some of the work they were doing. And I really saw the commander, the leader, allow people to stretch. And he knew they were making mistakes, but there was typical mistakes. He understood them, and they fixed their mistake, and they learned, and they were growing. But they had a climate where the commander had underwrote risk, where people felt good about themselves, and it was a growing environment. And then I walked into some headquarters, and you knew right away it was not going to be a good exercise. That headquarters was like ice. It was quiet. Nobody was moving around. Everybody was glued to their computer screen. and they were only doing exactly what they were told to do, nothing else. And then in the evening when it came time to brief the boss, you knew exactly why no one did anything else, because whenever anybody briefed the boss and they presented bad news to the boss went hysterical. He chopped them off at their knees. He ridiculed them publicly, and no one wanted to work for that boss. And quite frankly, no one did anything except what they were told to do, nothing else, because they knew that if they reached out on their own and stretched, and if they made a mistake, they were going to get chopped off at the knees, and no one wanted to experience that. And there was a difference between how that unit conducted their training exercise and how they failed again and again as compared to those units that allowed people to grow and to get better. Lesson here is that if you're a leader of a team, build a tough, tight, cohesive, high standard, disciplined, high performing unit that allows people to grow, where people feel good about themselves, that they're value added, and you create a command climate for growth and improvement to get better. And that's a team leader, and that's what's key. Those type of organizations handle bad news with patience and calm. This is tremendously important. I remember just recently, in the University of South Carolina, we reopened in the fall and invited everybody back, even though we still had the COVID-19 crisis going on. This was a high-risk decision. And when 35,000 students came back, students are who students are. They like to party, they're very social, they're gregarious, and the infections started to spike. We knew it was going to happen. And then the media was very critical. Other people were hugely critical of us. It was bad news, but we were persistent. We knew we had a good plan. We understood the virus. We understood how the virus was going to migrate through the entire student body. And sure enough, it did exactly what we had modeled. It went up and it came back down. But in the crisis, when it was the most difficult, when the bad news was just coming day after day after day, we persevered. In the midst of adversity, we continued walking. Someone said, whenever you're in hell or you find yourself in hell, keep walking. Now let me talk about being a teammate. This really came clear to me when I was in charge of a group of subordinates and they were not talking with each other. They're part of my team. And I said, how come you guys aren't talking with each other? You know, because they were so worried about their own organization, they were not helping each other. I said, well, to me, if you're not helping each other, then you have an issue with selfishness. You have an ego issue. Because really, I want you to work together. Here's a great example of a teammate that was covering somebody else's flank. In our Civil War, one of our iconic battles is the Battle of Gettysburg. It's a great battle. And they call it the high water mark of the Revolutionary War. The Confederates are marching across this big open field. They get to where the Union defenses are. There's an artillery battery commanded by a captain who graduated from West Point in 1861, 2 years before. His unit, his cannons are getting demolished. He's only got like 2 of 6 left. He himself is mortally wounded. And up on the hill, about 200, 300 meters to the south, is another artillery battery, and they're not at the brunt of the attack. But he knows that Alonzo Cushing, the guy who's really in trouble, is his West Point classmate, and he knows he's really in a hurt. So what does this guy do up on the hill? He takes 2 of his cannons and sends them down to Alonzo Cushing, the guy who was down there having a hard time. And this is teamwork. No one told him to do it. He just realized that my teammate is really in a hurt, and I need to help him. Alonzo Cushing ended up dying, and he ended up getting the United States Medal of Honor 150 years later. It's a tremendous story in itself. But part of that story is what his classmate did to help him persevere in the most critical time of the fight. It's a great example of teamwork and teammates selflessly, no ego involved, selflessly taking care of each other. Here's an area that I think is tremendously important, and people don't realize this. I think part of being a great leader is, if you're going to build a team, is that you yourself have to understand what it means to be a great member of your boss's team. Remember, I told you that no matter what rank you are in the United States military, you're going to still work for somebody. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff works for the President of the United States, who is the Commander-in-Chief. So he is, even though he's in charge of the entire military, he is still a subordinate to somebody else. So this whole issue of dynamic followership is important, to be a follower. That's why West Point's leader development model puts every brand new cadet as a follower, as a plebe. And they teach the plebes, you have 4 answers. Yes, sir, no, sir, sir, I do not understand, and no excuse, sir, or ma'am. So what does it mean to be a dynamic follower? It's quite simply, know your boss. And if you really want to know your boss when your boss is in phase 1. I'll explain that in a minute. And phase 2. So phase 1 is, let's say the boss has to make a decision and you're the subordinate staff officer. Your job is to be the subject matter expertise. That's the SME. You're supposed to be an expert in the knowledge of that issue. You have to bring an assessment and come to your boss with a recommendation. And what the boss normally expects out of you is your candor, to be able to speak the truth and not be concerned about the reaction, but to speak truth to the boss. That's candor. That's tremendously important. So phase 1 is the boss is trying to gather information. The boss has not yet made a decision. The boss needs your expertise, and the boss needs your candor and recommendation. At some particular point, the boss is going to make a decision. And at this particular time, your job is to recognize when he's no longer gathering information and the decision has been made. And what does the boss expect when the decision is made? He expects you to understand the decision, to assume ownership of it, and to execute it as though it was your decision. That's a degree of loyalty what the boss expects. So phase 2 is the decision is made. They expect you to understand it, assume ownership of it, and execute it as though your own. So I want to give you another great example of this, again from the Joint Readiness Training Center at JRTC, when I'm the evaluator of the unit going through there. So units will, before they do the mission, they will have a big planning session. And a lot of times that planning session goes late at night, and the staff is getting no sleep. They got toothpicks in their eyes that are keeping their eyes open. And they come up with a recommendation to the boss, and they're so emotionally tied to it. And the boss, at the other hand, has walked around the battlefield, has talked to some of the lower level people, the senior level people, has great understanding of what's going on. And it comes time for the staff to brief the boss on their recommendation for the mission. So they walk the boss through all the different course of action, they give their recommendation. They're emotionally tied to this. And the boss, big perspective, says, yeah, I like what you're recommending, but how about going a little bit over in this direction? And then you see this conversation start. The staff is so emotionally tied, they try to talk the boss out of it. And the boss gets a little frustrated and say, no, I want to go in this direction here. And this dialogue goes back and forth and back and forth. The problem with the staff as subordinates, as followers, was, did they hear the boss's decision? Did they recognize it? And because they're so emotionally tied to their recommendation, they failed to hear what the boss had said, and they failed to understand the boss had made a decision from phase 1 to phase 2. So we're the evaluators watching all this, and it's amazing what's taking place. So the meeting's over. The boss thinks that he had communicated a decision. The staff thinks they talked the boss out of it, and then they write the order and give the order to the subordinates. And what's amazing in all this is if they failed to realize, or if the boss failed to realize that the staff never understood the phase 2 decision, you have a train wreck that's about to happen. And it happened quite often. It was an amazing lesson in leadership, that how important it was that if you are a subordinate in your boss's organization, how important it was to be a dynamic follower, to understand your boss, to recognize when your boss is in phase one, needs your information, your recommendation, but when the boss has transitioned to phase two and made a decision, is now looking for loyalty and looking for you to understand, execute as though you had made that decision. So that's dynamic followership. So those are the three teams. Build a great team, be a great teammate, and be an incredible dynamic follower. All right, I'm going to go towards the last part of my presentation and talk about being a great staff officer and a couple other points of leadership I'm going to make at this particular point. I know I'm running short on time, so I'm going to just highlight some of the key points here, but you're welcome to look at these slides and to look at each and every one of these points on the slide and the information there. The thing I want to talk about on staff guidance is a staff member, you normally start working on a project, and when you start working, you have a very simple level of understanding. The more you start getting engaged in that project, the more complex level of understanding that you have. And when you get to a certain point, you master the knowledge of that issue. At some point, this is a communication skill. At some point, Mr. Staff Officer, you're going to have to brief somebody who does not have that level of understanding that you do. And they probably have the level of understanding in a very simplistic way, similar to the way that you had when you first entered into that problem set. Your job, your communication skill, is to communicate that very complex issue in a very simplistic manner. I call it bringing simplicity to the other side of complexity. And you have to recognize that the person you're briefing doesn't have that complex level of understanding, and you've got to bring those complex issues and communicate them in a simplistic manner. So it's a huge communication skill, and I see it all the time where staff members, the more they're involved in an issue, the more they like to pontificate how complex and how knowledgeable they are. And all that does is, to someone who doesn't understand what they're talking about, it just puts them to sleep. I don't know, in the United States we have this little phrase that we call the deer in the headlights. You know, if I'm driving a car at night and I see a deer, normally you just see the eyes of the deer, they glow with green, and the deer just stares at you. You know, so when you're briefing somebody and they're just staring at you and you know they don't understand what you're saying, then you have failed in communicating complex issues in a simplistic manner. So when you see the deer in the headlight look, stop what you're doing, back up, and bring it down to a simple level. You have to communicate clearly, whether it's oral, whether it's written. You have to communicate in a very logical, simplex, and concise manner. As a staff officer, if you're briefing your boss and your boss says, "Have you thought about this?" or "Have you thought about this?" I don't know about you, but when my boss tells me that, I look at it as I didn't do my homework. If my boss is telling me what to look for, I just failed to do the necessary analysis to anticipate that question or that issue. When a problem occurs, don't go into your boss's office and drop the problem on his desk. So what I would always say is, I want to keep my boss informed that there's an issue that's coming, but at the same time, I want to tell my boss that I am currently working on it. These are some facts about it. These are a couple ways that we can deal with it. Here's my recommendation. I will get back to you with more information as soon as I can. The other thing that I would say on a staff officer is, I've seen this a lot, staff officers get so emotionally tied to their recommendations that they present information from an emotional standpoint, and the emotion interferes with the facts. So normally I like to make decisions with facts. I want to know the facts. So when someone comes into me with emotion, I say, leave the emotion outside. Just give me what the facts are. Facts, not emotion. Facts, not emotion. That's what I like to say. And then finally, you want to be a member who is selfless, loyal, dependable, and you want to be a staff officer that has a reputation of excellence, so that the work you perform is excellence and everything you do is with a reputation of excellence. You know, one thing that we do in the military is that we rate our subordinates. This is a slide that I used to show my subordinates. I said, if you want a top rating, this is what I expect of you. If you want an average rating, I'm going to show you that slide in a minute. So this is what I told my subordinates. This is where you get a top rating from me. If you're number one, you must be a team player. I expect you to be competent, loyal, selfless, and that you're going to be there every time I need you. I'm not going to have to try to find you. You're there. You have a duty ethic with character that has unmatched integrity and moral courage. If you're a staff officer as a subordinate, I expect you to have great oral and written communication skills. I expect you to have to anticipate when problems occur, and I expect you to have good integrated analysis and with facts, not emotion. To continue with that, I expect that you'll have great people skills. The people skills allow you to work with all the different personalities that are out there in order to bring consensus. And sometimes the environment you're going to be working in is what I call VUCA, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And in that environment, if you can work with people's personalities to bring consensus, that's a skill, that's a tough skill set, but it's important. That you have natural leadership, you underwrite risk, as I had talked about before, and you know the difference between a thoroughbred and a noodle. So if it's a thoroughbred horse, they don't need a lot of guidance. They know what you're looking for. They're very self-motivated. Quite frankly, if you get in front of them, they're going to run you over. And if you try to push them, they're going to kick you in the teeth. So sometimes you have a subordinate who's a thoroughbred. Give them minimum guidance and let them go to solve the problem. But then sometimes you have a subordinate who's a noodle. Just think of trying to push a wet noodle. How far does it go? It doesn't go anywhere, right? The type of leadership that's going to move a wet noodle forward is that you get in front of the noodle, you pick it up, and you pull it along. So the point I'm trying to make is recognize your subordinates, whether they're a thoroughbred or whether they're a noodle, and then provide the appropriate leadership. In other words, don't get in front of a thoroughbred horse, you're going to get run over. And don't try to push a noodle because it's not going to go anywhere. It's going to need some a little bit more directed action. Now, if you compare that with average, the best way I describe average, I'm not sure if you have ever seen the Rocky movies. I absolutely love the Rocky movies. I'm Italian descent. Rocky Balboa was an Italian. Anyway, in the first Rocky movie, he defeats the world champion, Apollo Creed. And then he gets comfortable. And there's this other guy called Mr. T. This is the second movie. Mr. T comes around and he's got a hunger. And then Rocky's talented. He's a he's the world champion, but he's now complacent. And he doesn't have that eye of the tiger anymore. So when he gets into a fight with Mr. T just knocks the snot out of him, and he loses. So an average employee does not have that passion. It does not have that purpose. It does not have the eye of the tiger. An average employee is Rocky after becoming complacent after he had defeated Apollo Creed. You have a high duty ethic and character, but you get uncomfortable when someone starts asking you a tough question and you're kind of afraid to answer it because it might be embarrassing to you. The average employee has pretty fair people skills, but sometimes they crush personalities in order to accomplish the mission, and they're not as sensitive to the people's needs as they should be. And then on a leadership standpoint, there's a lot of micromanagement, there's less flexibility, and they struggle even with their physical standards. So these are what I say are average. And you normally will find yourself when you reflect on where you are with average and where you are with being a top employee. And this is kind of the difference. There's a slight difference in each one of those categories. And we highlight them in those slides. The next area I want to talk to you about before we wrap it up is senior level leadership. And senior level leadership is tremendously important. If you are a leader of a large organization, like similar to the position I'm in as the president of the university, the first thing I think that's tremendously important about senior level leadership is to know the environment and know the natural hierarchy of order. And then as you put pressure on certain points, understand what some of the impact and the second and third order effects are. Understand yourself in that organization, and then understand some of the competitors that are playing in there as well. Let me give you a good example. When I was in northern Iraq, I had a battalion commander that was in the town of Balad. Balad at that time was a very contentious area. It was near Samarra, and if you remember anything about the Iraq War, Samarra had the Shia mosque that the Sunni extremist Zarqawi went in there to blow up in order to get the Sunni Shia strife going, and the United States was going to be caught in the middle of that. So it was a very, very contentious area. Balad had a lot of fighting going on. So what does this battalion commander do to understand the environment and to try to bring some degree of peace into it? What he does is he finds two wealthy Iraqis, he builds a relationship with them, and through that relationship there's a lot of trust going on, and he encourages them to pull their money together to create a bank. There was no such thing as a bank in Saddam's era, so this bank started loaning money out. So this old dilapidated tomato paste factory took a loan out from this bank, and they got the tomato paste factory up and running again. As soon as the tomato paste factory was up and running again because of the loan, then all the farmers in the area who hadn't been farming for about 3 or 4 years said, now there's a market to bring my tomatoes, and I want to bring my tomatoes to the market, so I'm going to start farming again. So as the farmers decided to start farming again, they had to get the pumps running, they had to get the canals fixed, and in order to get the pumps running, you had to get the electricity working again. So the farmers did, a lot of pressure on the local government to fix the canals, to get the electricity running, and the government responded, and the government was able to do that. And when the government was able to provide the essential services of electricity and to fix the canals so that the farmers can start farming again, the farmers and the people started putting their trust in the government, and that's exactly what you need to do rather than putting trust into the insurgency. And sure enough, the government produced, electricity was working, the pumps started working, they started growing tomatoes. They put them in the back of their pickup trucks, they drove them to the tomato paste factory, and the trucks were lined up. And the factory was right on the main highway between Baghdad and Mosul, and it was plugging up the traffic, making a traffic jam. So another entrepreneur Iraqi said, I'll fix this traffic jam problem. He plowed out a field and created a parking lot. So now the cars are off the street, they're in the parking lot waiting to drop off the tomatoes. And another entrepreneur Iraqi said, there's a bunch of hungry farmers waiting to drop their tomatoes off. I'm going to create a restaurant. So he built a restaurant. And another one built a hotel, small hotel for them to spend the night if they had to. And the next thing you know, the whole place started growing economically. And then the farmers started farming, and they were hiring people back onto the farm to do the farming. In Balad, that was once a very contentious place, without firing a single shot, became one of the most quiet, economically successful places in all of northern Iraq. Because this really innovative battalion commander understood the environment, understood the natural hierarchy of order where farmers and farming and essential services were. He knew where to put the pressure so that you can produce what you needed to, and the government became legitimate, and then the economic segment started working, so people started having jobs again. It's unbelievable. So that's a great example of senior level leadership. Knowing the culture of your organization is tremendously important. And it's important to have the interpersonal skills to be able to build bridges and to knock down walls that are out there. And this is what I love about our university and our partnership with other nations, that we would send our students out to other nations, and we would invite other nations to come to our university simply for the ability to understand each other's culture. And the global economy that we have and the global engagements, interactions that we have are so essential to the future of our nations and our nation's relationships. And senior leaders must understand the culture. They got to recognize where risks and challenges occur. They got to have great leadership skills to build consensus. And you got to make sure that you hire the right people. I call it, there's a great book called Good to Great by Jim Collins. And he's got a whole chapter called Getting the Right People on the Bus. All that means is make sure you hire the right people. If you have a subordinate working for you that's not producing, you got to recognize that and get them out of there and get somebody else on there that's going to get the job done. I told you that number 10 was, dealing with adversity. And I want to talk to you about the man in the arena. This is a quote from Teddy Roosevelt. And back then he said it was the man in the arena. I kind of modified it so that this is gender neutral, because not only men are in the arena, there's also men and women in the arena as well. So let me read you this great quote. It's fantastic. It's not the critic who counts. It's not the man or the woman who points out how the strong one stumbles or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man and the woman who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes up short again and again, because there is no effort without error and shortcoming, but who does actually strive to do the deeds, who knows great enthusiasms, great devotions, who spends himself or herself in a worthy cause, who at the best knows in the end the triumph of great high achievement, and who at the worst, if he or she fails, at least fails while daring greatly, so that his or her place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who neither knew victory or defeat. So when you're in the arena, Mr. Leader, Madam Leader, when you're in the worst of circumstances, keep walking, because you know the passion of success, you know the passion of failure, and you're not like those critics on the side who know neither. And your place will be a place of recognition because you were the one in the arena. You were the one dealing with adversity.